What is your comment on the political violence in Zimbabwe?
Thank you very much. I think at this moment in time, we can relatively say that there's been an increase in terms of politically motivated violence, which is something that I probably have at least of a know-how. That is political violence. There's been an increase both intra-party and party violence that has been seen in different circumstances. Recently, we had violence in ZANU-PF that led to death of one of ZANU-PF members. Very worrying, especially at this moment in time when we're heading towards elections just a few months. So those internal contradictions within movements that are contesting for political power, having that level of violence is very much worrying.
How has it affected the political arena in Zimbabwe?
I think for the past 37 years, Mugabe and this regime have governed through fear. So the only tool they would use to instill that fear is violence. Violence against the opposition, violence against civil society, violence against journalists, violence against anyone who fundamentally disagreed with the ZANU-PF. So what then fear did was to then distance citizens from their civic responsibilities. You would remember that the reflections on voter apathy are a byproduct of violence atmosphere within our politics. So that has a huge bearing both in terms of participation by ordinary citizens in civilians in political affairs, but also broadly in terms of the image and the picture of the Zimbabwe that we want it to be known in the international arena. So that is very, very worrying in terms of the image that is depicted out, but also even within Zimbabwean citizens themselves who are living in diaspora, because of their access to social media. When these events go out, it has a bearing in terms of those who are thinking of coming back home, especially at this moment in time.
Mm-hmm. From a point of view, has there been escalation or a reduction in politically motivated violence, especially during such a time when we are heading towards the harmonized elections?
I think we can if we have a comparative analysis with the 2013 election, we can say, of course, there's been a decrease. But in terms of the current trends, for the past 3 months, I think there's been an increase in politically motivated violence. Why am I saying so? Because just after December, when we had a new, regime taking over government, you realize that issues of violence have been tried to be shunned out by political institutions and the government itself. But you realize that because of the internal contradictions that were birthed by the way this government took power, which according to me is a coup. So what happens is that there is that sharp construct between the military personnel, the securocrats, and the civilian population. So those in ZANU-PF who are ordinary members of the party who feel they have a say in the party are now in sharp construct with those within the securocrats who are now in control of the institutions, both of government and the political party. So these contradictions have led to the increase in violence between a party member and another party member who is a war vet, violence between a party member who is a war vet and a party member who is a military personnel. So these kind of contradictions have led to the increase in violence. If you then jump also to the opposition, you realize that there have been relative issues of violence that are a byproduct of contradictions on who takes over after the death of Morgan, Richard Tsvangirai. So all these kind of violence, and for me, they are not really, as it's been seen, as motivated by party leaders, but really necessarily motivated by a culture that is within ordinary citizens. So those who disagree have had this culture of resolving things violently, whether it's ZANU-PF versus MDC or individuals within a party, because of the culture of violence that we have been having for the past 37 years.
What do you think are the main causes to the escalation in violent activities?
I think it's because of lack of strong mechanisms within certain institutions to deal with these particular issues. For example, there's inter-party violence. We don't have a strong police force. It was captured by the military. So these guys cannot execute their duties freely and fairly in terms of the administrative justice procedures. You also have obviously part of the cause being, as I've said, the problem of having to deal with contradictions or disagreements through violence. So it's something that has been there in our society. So it's not only within the political alliance, there in the church. We have split in the Anglican church. We have people running with the machetes, on each other's back. So it's a certain culture. Even at a family level, you have contradictions between a wife and a husband, leading to escalation of violence. So cases of violence have been perpetuated by, a broad cultural problem in our society.
What needs to be done to mitigate against political violence?
It is very simple. Number one, we must deal with the culture of violence. How do we deal with the culture of violence? A long-term strategy, but we must begin to commit as a society. If you have political parties, we have the leaders of the church, the civil society, trade unions coming together. There have been efforts by these particular institutions to deal with this culture of violence. If you have people in the society disagreeing, some can resort to violence even within the students' movement. So it's something that is there even within the church, within the labor movement itself. So we must, at the first level, deal with the psychology of the mind. We must begin to conscientize our people, to begin to understand that differences can be resolved through dialogue. Because what Mugabe managed to do was to survive in what Niccolo Machiavelli calls the divide and rule tactic, whereby you divide those who are against you so that they begin to fight each other. So we must begin to understand that these are fundamental, pillars that Mugabe had to build in our society that we must begin to deconstruct. We must begin to speak to the importance of dialogue, the importance of language, the importance of respect and understanding between different citizens in our society. For me, that is very fundamental. Number two, we must begin to build strong institutions and strong individuals. Our society has been, for the past so many years, even since the takeover of Ian Douglas Smith in Unilateral Declaration of Independence, he began to build a strong individuals called Ian Smith. After Smith, with Robert Mugabe, strong, very strong individual. So society began to follow that particular trend. In the church, you have one person at the apex. Political party, you have one person at the... So we must begin to deal with the question of the big name political oligopolies. We must begin to introduce strong institutions that can be able to subject individuals to disciplinary processes. So we must create buffers against, the temptation of being violent. So it's only when somebody knows that there's a deterrence, there are consequences of being violent. So people have escaped through violence, number one, through our legal framework, the presidential pardon. So you have people in the secular class, especially the say, who used to commit violence acts against, citizens who went, free of charge after being given presidential amnesty, including murder cases and so forth. So we must begin to have strong institutions that give people, these particular benefits on the basis of a strong legal processes. So we must build strong institutions that can act as a buffer against the temptation for people to be violent.
Do you think, you were mentioning the issue of securocrats and the state apparatuses like the police, the army, central intelligence, how can they help in curbing this problem of intra-party and inter-party violence?
I think it is very simple. The role of the police as enshrined in the constitution is very clear, to maintain law and order. The moment we have the depoliticization of these institutions, they must first and foremost deal with the question of capture. Just today there was a interaction between under MISA, if I'm not mistaken, of journalists and the police. You realize that even the spokesperson of the police has deep internal contradictions around the role of the police as enshrined in the constitution in terms of how do they deal with political figures within the confines of electoral contestation. So we must begin to have first and foremost the depoliticization of the police so that the police can assume its responsibility. Number one. Number two, we obviously, in terms of the military, its role is very clear. Military deal with the broader sovereignty of our society, the protection of ordinary citizens. So in cases where obviously the military is deployed in the villages, that must not be the case. because violence can at times not be that of physical. It might be intimidation, as it were. That is violence. It might be on hate speech. So we must begin to deal with those questions. But fundamentally, the police also must obviously have its duty, operate freely in terms of arresting and in investigating acts of violence. So acts of violence must be investigated, but also they must beef up in terms of its attachment to the society. The police must be accessible. Police for the past 37 years has been a symbol of oppression. So we must also deal with that so that the people can be able to report the case of violence. If a husband beats up a wife, she must be able to go and report the police with a particular trust, because what is broken down is the social contract between the police and ordinary citizens. So we must deal with those issues so that the police can be able to assume its constitutional mandate in protecting ordinary citizens.
Into the political parties involved in intra-party political violence?
I think political parties must know that violence begets violence. Internal contradictions must not be resolved through violence. Political parties have disciplinary institutions to deal with acts of violence. That's number one. Number two, they have mechanisms to deal with the internal contradictions. In any case, it is healthy for institutions to disagree. I don't have a problem with people in ZANU-PF questioning the legitimacy of the military in terms of how ZANU-PF runs its institution, because it is a civilian movement. So equally, even in the opposition movement, there must be mechanisms of dealing with contradictions in any movement, because I believe that it is out of internal contradictions that a movement can have a rebirth. So people must allow to have conversation. They must be motivated to deal with that. But fundamentally, political party leaders, because many times when there's violence, it is them who are appointed to say, if these people are violence against these people, they are your people. So they must take the responsibility upon themselves to deal with the culture of violence within ordinary card-carrying members of political parties, to say we are far away, or we've at least escaped the era of violence in our society, so that individuals in a party can disagree. It's either someone wants to be in council, they contest in a primary election, they must be allowed to do so, but they must understand that those issues of contradicting can be dealt with through dialogue. So something that we must deal with at a psychological level, to say how do we make sure that political parties motivate their people. I'm happy that some are signing peace pledges and so forth, especially youth assemblies of political parties, the youth wing, with Chipungano and ZANU-PF. We must begin to deal with that probably at a level of epistemic decoloniality, to deal with that which has been instilled in their minds, that if so and so disagrees with you, go and unleash violence. People must be able to disagree, use language, to disagree with each other. So it's something that political parties must commit to more organically than these high sounding nothing gatherings or proclamations, whether it's ED saying this, but really on the ground, citizens must be able to be coached, to be able to be educated, to be conscientized around this particular issue of violence.
You have made specific reference to youth initiatives, to the youth wings in political parties. How about civic organizations in the media? How can they help in curbing this problem of political violence?
I think the media is at the center of everything. Why am I saying so? Because the media for me is a very strong central feature between different institutions in a society, and its way that it relays its messages is through language. So that culture is assumed by citizens that we must be able to communicate through the beauty of language, because media makes one understand the importance of who we are. What makes me human is my ability to articulate issues. That's what makes me human. A dog is a dog because it can't speak. An animal is an animal because it can't speak. The moment you are able to say something in different languages of the world, you are able to be classified as human. So the media is at the center of showing citizens how information can be translated from one individual to another through language. So the media has the responsibility, number one, to make sure that the information goes out legitimately, because part of the challenges that we faced in our society was capture of the media by the state or different institutions with different interests in our society. So that has an effect and a bearing in terms of how they report. So at times contradictions are the way people perceive our society. So the media has a role in terms of how the media engages political figures, how it engages the civil society, how it engages securocrats in their role. For example, if somebody begins to question if ED is a town hall meeting, then they question his commitment to media, to peace and in our society. that then put on the media to say this is it is commitment, and those issues, if they are hammered, the society can begin to follow that particular suit in terms of dealing with the question of violence in our society.
Okay, Ostallos, I would like to thank you for giving us the pleasure of interviewing.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.